On this webinar today, I have Tamara Yakaboski with me and introduce you. And I'm going to read your bio and then just see what you want to share as well. From educator and scholar to climate crisis practitioner, Tamara Yakaboski, PhD, a recovering academic and rule follower, coaches and mentors folks transformations to break out of the rule book and live an unapologetic life in relationship with nature and community. Her vision is to create community, co-learning, collaboration, and care that weaves feminism, depth psychology, mindfulness, mind-body connection, nature-based activities, and local global impact. I met Tamara this summer. She came and did a course with the Somatic Wilderness Therapy Institute, and I think we immediately fell in love with each other and knew that there was some follow-up work to be doing in relationship to the crossovers of our work. So thank you for collaborating here with the Institute and with me today and beyond. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about your work and how you came to this.
So I'm trained as a social scientist. So I love people and human behavior and humans in organizations, kind of like the caged human. And then I realized over the years, especially working in higher ed, that being sort of the caged animals that we were in these like concrete buildings of higher ed, we were all suffering from this like disconnection to our bodies and disconnection to the outside. So really just noticing and working with graduate students and faculty and staff over the years of like, there was a lot of trauma. And at the time I didn't really understand trauma. I still don't understand trauma. That's why, Katie, that's why I'm in your class, your trauma class. Describe it 5 or 6 years ago as like I was a talking head, disconnected from my body. I could not tell you anything from the neck down. And then I had what I'd like to say my first breakdown, which was a physical breakdown, like herniated disc, followed by like the worst shingles in the world before I was 40. It is like in healing the body, all it did was like expose another layer, right? Like, and so I'd go in and I'd try different modality and start healing and doing different things. And it just kept like exposing things, exposing to all the way. I think I hit my 5-year anniversary of that first breakdown last month. To like, here I am now really feeling this urgency for the climate work, this urgency to help folks heal their soul so that we can heal the soil. And I think that once you get reconnected for me, I believe like once we're reconnected inward and, interconnected, then we start to really see our real purpose and the work that we need to be doing versus the work that we're doing, but it's like there's no soul. And so it's just like I kept following the soul, right? Like the soul path, and here we are.
I really hear this theme of, as you became more embodied in yourself, just feeling the interconnection of everything, of the health of you to the health of the planet, and really in a way not being able to unfeel that or deny it, and really some new awarenesses sprung up.
I have this really strong example of like sitting in this beautiful Colorado, it was up near Red Feather, and backpacking, and the sun's coming up, it's like late spring, so wildflowers are blue, so it's beautiful, right? It's quiet, it's peaceful, coffee's made, and I'm doing my morning journaling, which is one of my practices, and I have this flash of like the whole area, the valley that I'm in, just being like burned and dead, right? And that to me is the urgency, right? And then it was the grief and the heartache of my daughter who's 8,
Mm-hmm.
what she will see when she's 40, backpacking in Colorado, hopefully she can, right? Is like, right. It's just like the heartache. And like, how do we sit and go through that versus like skipping right into the action, which I think is how I had always approached it.
And feeling you and knowing you as such a doer and an action taker, that is profound, that shift of you are still a doer and an action taker, but from a different place. And really what I hear, feeling the dropping down into your body and into the grief and into the experience, and finding your way into acting from there versus from here, or from the like get things done, which is a profound difference, though may not look so different from the outside, but very, very different from the inside.
I mean, I think about like really wise folks have talked about this idea of like we needing to shift from the exploitive mindset to a regenerative one, right? And so as doers, capitalist society, I work with a lot of high achieving folks, you know, in higher ed, and you know, so we're doers, right? Like get things done, work a lot, have a product, all of this. But that just like perpetuates this exploiting of our energy to also like out, right? And this, it's very easy, I think, to other, right? So we other nature, as well as people, and you know, all of the isms that we're sort of suffering from right now are all sort of wrapped up in that. Versus regenerative is if I slow down a little to connect in and to connect out, I will be less harmful.
I kind of want to skip to, and it's not the end at all, but I want to say like, what is the most important thing to you? Like, what do you hope in this new iteration of what you're doing and working with people and really being a guide and a coach? What do you most hope to bring to people or communicate or support them in?
I have been blessed to have a group of some amazing women in my life who have been coming to my backyard during the pandemic for like a climate feminist circle, I think is what I called it. But you know, we would get together, food and community and conversation. And so I've been able to like experiment with this group and be in fellowship with them. And so what I see now is what I want to bring and create is that sense of how do we take a mindful approach to the process of regeneration of soul and soil, and
I love
do
that.
so in community, right? And in a like I think about like the feminist ideologies to me are, you know, support, community, connection, sharing of resources, you know, equity work, so, you know, lifting up others and you know, resisting exploitation, right? So do, you know, having that container of that while you go through this transformative process with all of, you know, our mindsets, beliefs, conditioning, socialization, all of the things you want to talk about, and then like shifting that to get to this like regenerative community through that, like that dark, deep soul work, so they reconnect to their purpose in life, but also in the action of climate, right? In the action of like saving humanity.
So in that context and other contexts where you have been talking to people, what are the themes that you're hearing and finding?
We wanted to go into like, okay, I'm bought in, tell me what to do. Right? Like, because we want to, like, we see a problem, you know, yeah, okay, I'm there, it fits my beliefs, I want to do something. And I too wanted that, like, okay, here are the resources, let's like, you know, we need to have more conversations, we need to get with our politicians, We need to engage in the things that, the top ones that like the Drawdown Project tells us are like the big move the needle things. I'm like, okay, so I'm saving to put solar on my house, right? Like, but then I'm like getting more into it, and it's like, wait a minute, we don't engage in like this lifestyle shift, right? We engage in like these band-aid solutions that help us feel better. Or it's like, I really can't do much, right? So it's like, it's the hopelessness, because like the one thing or the 5 things you're doing or the 10 and 20 things you're doing.
Yeah.
Right. But we've got a bigger problem, right?
Yes.
And I think the one thing that surprised me at first was the amount of shame that comes into the conversation of like, I'm not doing more.
Yes.
So I really don't want to engage in the feeling part.
Yes. Oh gosh. And shame just shuts us down and connects with the hopelessness and the helplessness and the overwhelm
and the powerlessness. And so that's why I'm really interested more in then getting people to think about like, and this comes from some work by a couple climate scientists who put together a book that I'll share the resource at the end, All We Can Save. And they talk about, like, so if you think about a Venn diagram with 3 circles overlapping in the middle, right? One is like your skills and your gifts. Like, what is the thing that you have to offer that's unique to you? What are your gifts, and then what are your skills? Like, what's your background? And then what in climate needs doing that you're passionate about? So if each of us finds our overlap and we each do the thing that we are here to do with the gifts that we have and the skills that we have with the thing that we're passionate about, and we're all doing that,
I love
right?
that.
Then that's like massive change, right? That's a paradigm shift.
I think this is so significant, really looking at what's our particular way, because I know for myself, it can be overwhelming looking at like, what are the ways I'm not doing this, and how much time do I have, and what is enough? So I think there's something really important as we're looking at that. It's like, okay, what is mine to do, and what else, what else? But I think there's such a fine line between, or not a fine line sometimes, but between empowerment and overwhelm, which then just keeps us kind of in this place of stuck and not moving in the right direction. And so I'm just curious for you, what have you found for yourself? And I think you started speaking to this, but what have you found really is your self-care, or what supports you in staying in that place of hopefulness or positivity, or supporting others in doing that?
Learning for the first time to like sit with emotions. Not something I was ever really good at, but like learning to sit with that and learning. And I think that's like a big thing, especially for, I think sort of this US based culture, right? Where we like pain and, discomfort and anger, aren't really encouraged. And then they're also like very gendered and cultured as well. So we could just kind of like, oh, let's just do happy. We want to do happy.
And there's 1,000 ways we can disconnect from our feelings at all moments and buy something or eat something or whatever else we want to do.
Yeah. And capitalism's caught up to this, right? Are caught on to that, right? That there's tons of greenwashing with products, right? It's, buy this product and you'll be contributing blah, blah, blah to the environment. But I'm like, do I really need another water bottle, or do I really need another whatever? So companies have caught on to this, like, we purchase to like numb out. And so, And I also don't, I'm not a therapist. So I'm not going to say don't go numb, like don't numb yourself. Like at some point, like sometimes you need to watch. I want to watch Ted Lasso on rerun. It's funny. It makes me feel good, right? Like,
well, I think it's
so
a balance, right? What you're speaking to is feeling your feelings and acknowledging, yes, we also need to sleep at night so that we can function and do action. And how do we do self-care in the midst of, which might be disconnecting in some way, in a conscious way
yeah,
for moments, but not as a way of being in the world.
yeah. And I think about like, I chat with a couple amazing climate scientists, one's at UNC, or University of Northern Colorado, and one's at Colorado State University. And I check in with them, and they're like, yeah, we've always felt this, right? Like we have known and climate and climate emotions are just now more in the mainstream conversation. Right. So I really think about like the first responders to climate, right? Our climate scientists who have been sitting with this for decades, watching it come. And then the rest of us that are just like, oh, wait, like this is here. And so for me, I have come to the place where it is learning to sit in the emotions and the feelings, because we're not going to reverse this. Things are set in motion. So I can't ignore it. I can't deny it. I can't go back in time. Loss will continue to happen. And so I need to, learn how to build my tolerance, as we talk about, like build the tolerance for all the feels, the overwhelming joy at the wildflowers, but also the heartache of the wildfires.
So how are you bridging this gap? And I've seen you do this a little bit. Like, what would that look like if you were working with people, working with that balance of the being with and the action? Because I know you're definitely still, like I said, very into action, and it's a dance.
I want to share this sort of brief quote that I was reading. So Rumi said, "Sorrow prepares you for joy. It violently sweeps everything out of your house so that new joy can find space to enter." And so I really think about sort of sharing of being uncomfortable in the emotions, because the emotions will sort of point us to where we need to take action. So I think helping people go into the discomfort that we don't like to feel, knowing that we're there, one, for like our own honoring and healing, but also to say, oh, this is the thing that I'm passionate about, right? Like, I love talking about anger because it's, as a woman identified person, anger is the one thing like I'm generally not allowed to have. And so it's like, ooh, anytime I feel like anger and it's like expressing out, I'm like, a boundary of value of mine just got crossed. Let me go look at where it's pointing. And so I think like that can help people like find their way of like, what's the thing that I want to do? Like, where's my anger coming out at?
I love that. I love that from a somatic perspective. Anger is about a boundary. Anger is about taking a stand, right? And so I love that when we can be embodied with our anger as opposed to out of control, right? When we can actually harness it. And for many of us, that's been challenging, in however we've seen anger come out in our families or in the world, but really looking at the wisdom of it on a organismic level. And then in this particular arena, I love that. It's like, how do we harness that and look at the wisdom of the anger, and then where my value is, or where my boundaries been crossed in relationship to that, and how can I take action or take a stand in support of that?
Yeah. Yeah. And that anger, right? It's such fiery energy, right? So like in that harnessing that you're talking about, right? Like using that to like lift you up to go do the action. You know, and I think we see this with sort of the youth climate movement, of the amount of like the anger and the action that they are like demanding and you know, putting behind their work. So I think we can kind of see this, and I think there's a lot to listen to and learn from with like the youth movements that are happening, that are sort of calling on, you know, the end of a lot of the systemic, you know, racism and climate work, climate injustice, and, you know, as they're all interconnected, and kind of really looking and listening to that.
Yes, as you say that, I just think about eco-psychology and really looking at the understanding that the health of humans is interconnected with the health of the planet, and vice versa. And really, I think this work is so much about, or this awareness really, again, keeps coming back to sustainability and interconnectedness, and how we treat our bodies goes along with how we treat our fellow humans and how we treat our earth. And there has been so much difference of power, and also objectification happening in so many ways in communities in our life. And this is, it's like something that as we feel, again, we start to feel all the layers. We could say, you know, eco means the ecosystem, right? Which is all of that and all of us, and just feel the many different ways to really enter into the conversation, enter into action, as we look at that, really the web there. I hear this piece around that's a big part of your work, that's really connecting with our emotions, connecting with our bodies, connecting with our feelings. And I'm curious if there are other ways that you think about, you know, how do we really feel our connection to the earth? Like what can really help us? Or there are a lot of people in our community who are therapists and educators, right? And you know, some of them already do nature-based therapy. So, but I'm curious from your perspective, what are the, you know, as an educator for so many years, what are the ways that you might help people feel a greater sense of connection?
Helping people learn how to do their self-work and grow as a human in a community. And so really bringing in the humanity into content and curriculum that's about like this, but this is about English literature, or, you know, whatever. I'm like, yeah, but okay, how do you help the person in your class learn something about themselves through English literature, right? So it's all like an opportunity to learn about ourselves. And so I think that, so I started doing, I think there's mindfulness and meditative and visualizations that I would bring into my work as a way to create community, right? Like what is missing in, I think, a lot of our spaces, and you know, I know this way more than I do and can speak to this more, of like, we are missing this ritual and the ceremony piece in a lot of our institutions and our practices. And that I think is very connecting when we have those markers. And when they're also then connected in with seasons and cycles and nature pieces.
Yes, I love that. I love that. And I just think about, you know, in the work that we do, and Tasha was going to speak to this today. And so I'll just say, you know, so much of it really is, yes, doing practices, inviting people, you know, if we're in a role of facilitation, whether that's coach, educator, therapist, really inviting people to sit with, right? To sit with themselves, to sit with the earth, to observe, to see the interconnection, and sometimes with prompts. And I remember you led us this summer in an experience of sitting with the natural world, or having a conversation with the natural world, and noticing what gets evoked in us, and what does that inspire in us in order to take action. So as you say that, I also think about ceremony and ritual is so much at its heart about connecting, right? About connecting with what is, connecting with our own bodies, connecting with community, connecting with earth, connecting with the seasons, connecting with just like I always say saying yes to what is, but it's a moment of pause, and it's a moment or moments of intentionality and listening and dialogue, right? And so as you speak to that piece, I just feel just the vast opportunities there are in pausing and coming into relationship on all the levels, in all the different ways, again, with ourselves, with other humans, with the natural world, with that which is beyond us, that something else can happen in that pause and in that dialogue, those dialogues that are happening.
Actually, I have one more quote to share from this may be an interesting book for therapists and helpers on the webinar, but it's called Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change, Leslie Davenport. But she says this line that I think is really beautiful. Grief is a part of healing. Grief is preparing the soil of our psyche. It's the uprooting old beliefs and loosening our internal ground, which has been tamped down by habit and routine. Many times of grief, and learning to uncomfortably ride those cycles of grief. And, I recall an early time in the pandemic, I think it must have been, we were nearing the first holiday season, and just like sitting there with just overcome with just grief, and just, I felt shattered. And I decided in that moment to like do a little painting or something, just to like stay there, paint whatever. Like, I had some watercolor. I had my kids' watercolors. And so just working through that, right? The cycle moved, right? The grief moved, and I felt lighter. Like, was the situation resolved? No, but my ability to engage with it and find a way to move forward came, right? And so I think with this, right, if we can ride the waves of grief, we get back to the hopefulness of action and community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. As we're having this conversation, what I'm feeling is what huge topics these are. I mean, really huge, really huge, right? And so I'm like feeling my own body and feeling my own emotion, and just feeling the breath of like, again, oh, where do we start? And I also hear this is the place to start, actually, feel our bodies, because if we're not feeling our bodies, we can't actually take effective or conscious action from the place of overwhelm, or from the place of collapse, etc. So just feeling the hugeness as we're it's like, oh, there's so much here, and I know there's more, which is why we're having this conversation. But go ahead and
yes, and to that, I would say why I think that Tasha and I will be co-facilitating the climate embodied climate conversations in December and January, so that there is space, right? Like people, I think, are starting to create the spaces of the containers of support and the containers of sharing those feelings so that we can work through them and be together. I was able to attend an online multi-week retreat with the Earth Holders where it was on climate justice. And one of the practices that we did, I was quite simple and powerful, which was we would be partnered with another person and we would practice co-listening of, okay, I've got 5 minutes just to share in a non-judgmental space. And in the co-listener role is to hold the space, but not to, there is no response, there is no rebuttal, there is no questioning, there is just one human holding space for the other person's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And then gratitude for that space and sharing. And then the next person shares. And it's like, we need that container of, as you say, relative safety to share. So I would love to turn to maybe take a question. Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So the question is,
yes.
What are your thoughts about the ways in which therapists might help empower and foster resilience in clients who are already facing the impacts of climate change? Example, victims of extreme weather events, have lost home and community, etc., and in clients who are impacted by environmental racism and classism.
One of the pieces that came up for me as you were just sharing before and with this question is connection, right? And this is part of the feeling ourselves not alone. And even, part of what you're doing is calling people together to talk about this. But I think there's something about when we feel impacted, a response can be to disconnect. And then we're even more alone and feel more depressed. So the first thing that pops up, and you may have some other thoughts, but is really the connection, whether that's connection with therapists, connection with family, connection with friends, connection with others that care, that are having these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things about community trauma as a category of trauma, when we're all going through something, is it has often, in the literature that I've seen, higher rates of healing in that people come together because there really is a shared experience, and that is a part of what creates safety and support and health and healing. And so I just think of that, like, how do we, any ways to create connection, small or large?
How are we getting information and support and language to broader helpers, right? So I know I see a lot of climate aware therapists and coaches and helpers in the UK and Australia. And in the US, it's kind of a smaller population, but hopefully growing. So the more, I think for me, we get it out to a wide range of helpers, then that gets greater support to the, some of the populations that Rachel is sort of mentioning in this question, right? Of knowing how to work with, climate related, PTSD or climate anxiety, and, knowing sort of how to work through those pieces that normalizes the responses.
And there's something you just spoke that I want to highlight, which is really having language for it and the normalizing. And I think about the word we use sometimes in therapy of congruence, that when we have the words for our experience, or we can name out loud, or have someone else name or see our experience, there's often an exhale. It doesn't change all the circumstances, but it really highlights that this is real and that something is happening. And so you say that, I think about, there are a lot of different opinions in the world about what's happening with the climate and if there's even a problem or not. And so to have that recognized and often, I think we're all impacted, even if we don't have the conscious awareness of that. And so to have the words, to have the that acknowledged in and of itself can be supportive and relieving to some degree, or make a little bit more space, I think, for what comes next.
It's two big and really critical, important questions, I think, in there. And there are some great resources and organizations doing some really amazing work. And for example, the support groups that Tasha and I are facilitating, we're operating them on like a pay what you can model, with the idea of like, there's a set cost, but if you can pay more and pay it forward, do. If you can't, okay. With the idea that we're taking a third of the payments from those and supporting, we selected Climate Justice Alliance, which I just put in the chat box for folks, to take a look at, while that doesn't necessarily address therapists, it does address folks doing work to advocate for and educate on and with folks who are directly impacted by environmental racism and these extreme weather events that we're seeing that are disproportionate, right? This is greatly a justice and privilege conversation.
I wonder if you want to speak to a little bit about this, what you're going to be offering with Tasha. And you didn't get to meet Tasha here on the webinar. She's interning with us at the Somatic Wilderness Therapy Institute and has had a whole first career as a journalist. And one of the things that she has focused on in her career has been climate science and policy, and really looking at that through media, representing those through big media outlets. So it's a passion of hers. She's doing a lot of work with connecting people with the natural world, and also sharing, having a voice in that arena.
In order to sort of get with, gather folks and sort of talk through and get really a sense of what are the challenges and feelings and experiences that people are feeling with this idea of, when we go through the grief and the anxiety and the anger, that and doing so in a container of support, that we move towards resilience and empowerment towards action. So this will be shared out with you if you haven't seen it already. And we're kind of just playing around with some dates at this point, and kind of seeing what works and what connects in with folks. Right now, we're doing them all, online to increase access. For those of you in sort of the Front Range Boulder area, we may bring them to you. Tasha's great about doing these mindful hikes in the Boulder area. So we kind of have like these daydreams of like putting it all together and having it be this like really like pow kind of a morning out with folks. I mentioned this book, and I love this book, and I would love for, if you're not familiar with it, but All We Can Save. They have a great page. So for the therapists and the helpers in the group, I really want to bring you to this page because they've put together the few links, or not the few, but there are the links on, climate aware therapy, emotional methodology. So this is your EMDR, your mindfulness, your different sort of tools, and kind of how that works out in terms of, working through climate work. There's Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects. And she's got great books and tools and activities to work with folks through. And then, generative somatics, I am thinking about the BIPOC populations and supporting that work. I encourage you to take a look at generative somatics. Is doing some really amazing trainings and support. So there's some good resources out there, and I would encourage you to connect with us and come to a support group or I do have, if I could find, I think maybe it'll have to be emailed out. I'm not able to share it right now, but I'll share, we'll email this out, and it has the hyperlinks to, you know, all the websites, email addresses to connect in with folks, as well as for the next stage of conversations. And then also that climate emotions resource that I just shared out. So we'll get that emailed out to folks as well.
Thank you so much for this conversation today. And I think
Thank you, Katie.
Feel in my whole body the importance of this and our embodiment and our listening and our pausing and our being in relationship with others and the earth and the web of life as we take action and really sit with what's next on a moment to moment basis.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone who joined us. So good to have you here.
Thank you everyone. And thank you, Katie.
So good to have this conversation.
Yeah, and people, please feel free to reach out and continue the conversation afterwards.